This is the Climate Academy Systems Understanding course, and this is Chapter 5, the United Nations. So if you're just joining us, you're very welcome. And this is part of a whole series of chapters and episodes. And everything which I'm going to say can be found in Chapter 5 here of the student book. This is available for free from the Climate Academy website. And this course provides a systems view of the crisis. So political systems, environmental systems, and democratic systems. And this chapter is especially dedicated to those political and democratic systems on the UN. At the end of the chapter, you can go back to the Climate Academy Moodle, and inside there you can do a quiz on this chapter, and that could be a brick in your wall towards a Climate Academy certificate. So let's get going. This is Chapter 5 on the United Nations. What is going on in this painting? This is a painting by Jacques-Louis David, and it's a painting in France. This is 1789, and this is just outside of Paris in a place called Versailles, and more specifically than that, this is a tennis court. This is where the French Revolution started. This chapter is about the United Nations, which embodies certain values, democratic values, values of rights. And this is a moment in France where those things are stated with a great deal of conviction and energy for the first time. Now, there is, of course, a longer history behind this, but this really is a dramatic moment, a dramatic step forward towards the modern democracies and the modern commitment to human rights, which we now take to be universal. So let's jump into the picture in more detail. What we can see in the painting here is lots of people who've come together to protest and to declare that this is the true France here. This is the third estate. France at the time in the Ancien Régime was split into three estates. The clergy, the first estate, the aristocracy, the second estate, and the third estate, everybody else. And this is the third estate. They've come to this tennis court to declare that they are the true France. And the others are welcome to join. The first and second estates, they're welcome to join in here, but this is where the true France is. It's not where the others are in the palace. So it's a very dramatic moment. You could ask, well, how did we get to this point? Well, France is under a tremendous amount of stress. It's been involved in the 7 Years' War and also the American War of Independence. It's been trying to help the colonial Americans fight off the British, and is bankrupt. On top of that, there's been 2 years of consecutive failed harvests. That doesn't help. And fundamentally, there's just massive inequality in France. The wealth is not fairly shared. Some people have privileges and don't pay taxes, and the burden is on this third estate. So here they are in this tennis court, and they're declaring that this is the true France with them. We can zoom in on a few details. So in the middle of the painting, you have Sylvain Bailly. He is the Parisian mayor, and just underneath his arm, there's a little cluster of three people, and one of them is a monk and the other is a Protestant vicar. And they represent unity. They're coming together in a little huddle. They represent this idea that France can unify and not be divided on religious lines. The other person, perhaps the most important person in this painting, is just on the other side of the mayor. And he is stood there with his chest out, and he is really lost in the moment. And this is Maximilien Robespierre, and he will become the leader of this French Revolution as it's going to rampage through Paris and into the rest of France, and eventually through Napoleon into the rest of Europe. But let's just zoom away from those details and people for a moment and take a look at this picture with a wide angle. And if we really think about this picture, there's two things a little bit odd about it, or perhaps could be improved. Now, I say that very carefully because Jacques-Louis David is an absolute master painter. But imagine a child brought this picture to you, perhaps just stick men rather than these full-bodied, amazing portraits. You could say two things to the child. You could say, first of all, why don't you colour it in? This painting has no colour. Now, in fact, Jacques-Louis David did start to colour it in, but the problem is that the revolution from this point on, this spasm which happens in the tennis court, quickly leads, this is June 1789. In July, you have the storming of the Bastille, which today is the National Day in France. And then in August, you have the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So this extremely rapid movement of events is going to turn into something rather toxic. And that toxicity leads to the death of lots of these people. As Dupin said, the revolution is going to eat its own children. And this moment here, by the time the painting is finished like this, people are starting to die on the guillotine. So there's not much point to colour them in. So the lack of colour in this painting shows the pace at which events from here went forward. Okay, so that's just one interesting feature of the painting. The second one, though, is even more informative. This painting, you could say to your child, is a little bit like there's a lot of wasted space. Everybody's in the bottom half of the painting. Like, why would you do that? You could almost cut the painting in half, give the top half back to the child and say, okay, do me another painting. But no, because that is the point of this painting. The actual focus of attention in this painting, what is being painted, is not people. It's the ideas. It's this energy in the room. And if you look to the left, you can see that this energy is billowing the curtains. It's turning umbrellas inside out. This is a painting about that energy, about the idea. In fact, if you look again, everybody's pointing to it. Everybody's pointing to the real object of this painting, which is this empty space. Because France, although crops were down, although finances were down, and although people's lot was down, one thing that was on the up was the Enlightenment, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the values. And those values are things like democracy and the rights of man. So this is a painting about an idea, a powerful idea. So we have now the object for this chapter. From this painting, although it's going to end up in an absolute catastrophe for France, the reign of terror is just a few years away, led by Robespierre, these hands which are now unified, pointing to this beautiful, noble idea, that is going to flip into a frenzy of paranoid finger pointing, and is going to end up in the guillotine, and is going to end up in a bloodbath. But fundamentally, at this point here, in this kind of stem cell moment of the French Revolution, something powerful is happening, and that is going to endure through the centuries and is going to end up in the United Nations. So this chapter is a great place to start, a chapter on the United Nations, because there's two things at work here. On the one hand, you have a revelation about the rights of people. You have a revelation about the dignity of a democracy. And this has an energy and a power to it. But at the same time, we're also aware that it can fail and it can not meet its own ideals. In the French Revolution, of course, this happens in the most catastrophic and dramatic way. But we mustn't let go of those ideals. So, this is our start off to chapter 5 on the United Nations, question mark. Like, are we united now, globally, as nations? What can we learn from a box of cornflakes? One day I was eating cornflakes, and it was just before I was going to school to teach Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So I just mentioned that the time of this painting was a time of the Enlightenment when ideas were on the rise. And I think if you looked into the pockets of the people in this picture, you would find a copy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract. In many ways, Rousseau is the godfather of this revolution. He's not alive at the time, he's died, but his ideas are absolutely central to what is happening in this picture. So there I am eating my cornflakes, and a thought comes into my head. Because, and if I have a box here, because if you have a box of cornflakes, it's quite easy when you open a box to feel a bit cheated. Because look at that. Look at all this wasted space, this empty space for nothing. Like, you paid for a big box and what? You just get this. But this is critical for this. Without this, what you would get here would just be a crumbled mess, like corn crumbs or something, not cornflakes. And you haven't been conned, you haven't been cheated. It's not like cornflakes, sorry, too many puns, but this air here is essential for the life of all these people here. And this is a beautiful metaphor for how the people are thinking in this painting and how Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophy works. This here is the democratic space. This here, Rousseau calls the general will. And this, everybody who participates in this, through dialogue, through civic service, through education, through voting, through democracy, notice all the flakes they nestle with each other, they find a safe place to live together. In fact, on some boxes of cornflakes, it says, like as an excuse, it says something like, contents may have settled during transit. Yes, that's it. That's a beautiful way to explain a democracy, that the contents settle over time. People in a democracy, they learn that they're in this together, and they can learn to live together if they can think about what they have in common. And this is a bit the problem with democracies. They always seem a little bit inefficient. They always seem like a waste of time. It takes a lot of effort to think about how other people are thinking. It takes a lot of effort to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. It also takes a lot of effort to share resources. So in a democracy, what you get is a conversation, a dialogue in which, if you listen properly, you get to have a much more equitable shared space. This belongs to everybody. So A box of cornflakes is a nice metaphor for our modern democracies. It's easy to laugh at them, be cynical about them. It's easy to think that they're just a waste of time, that, well, things would just be more efficient if we just focused on the economy. But democracies are absolutely critical. This breathing space enables those things not to get crushed. Who's missing? Well, if you look at the painting from the tennis court oath, then all these cornflakes are male. There are no female allowed. And that was because they were too irrational. They had to be kept at a safe distance. They're just looking down from the windows with their umbrellas. This injustice was pointed at by the brilliant Olympe de Gouges and Mary Wollstonecraft, and they protested that the Declaration of the Rights of Man should include women also. Like, why just men? And it is true that Rousseau, that's a particular weak spot of Rousseau and his philosophy. So this ideal, which is expressed in the tennis court oath, has an imperfection, a very serious imperfection at the beginning. And this idea of democracy is eventually extended to include all people, no matter what their gender, no matter what their race, and no matter what their level of wealth. So the ideal of democracy here in the painting is it's onto something, but it hasn't yet found its fullest expression. Why do we have a United Nations? Well, the shortest answer to that is that on June the 26th, 1945, the United Nations was declared into existence because we just had World War II. A world war in which the basic dignity and rights of all people had been savagely attacked by fascist regimes. So sometimes suffering forces us to remember what really is important above our heads. Sometimes it's catastrophes or wars or great suffering which reminds us of these deep values which we all hold and should be pointing at. So the United Nations came into existence in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And this relates to the theme of this chapter, that we must always remember what is deeply dignified and valuable in all people. And that ideal should be continually pointed at, even if it has imperfections, even if it doesn't always work, even if at the beginning not everybody included. This is a long human project towards dignity and towards respect for all people. And so the UN is an embodiment of that, even though in its conception it had imperfections itself. We'll get to these later in the chapter. The UN was essentially founded with colonial architecture. The big powers formed the Security Council. America, Russia, UK, France, and China. So there are imperfections even within the structure of the UN. But again, what's important is this reminder of what is fundamentally valuable. So here's an extract from the textbook read by Thais, which focuses on one of those attacks on this principle, and it's the attack of Guernica. And this attack on the Spanish village, painted by Picasso, is now held inside the United Nations building. What is the UNFCCC? Well, to understand that, we have to go through a blizzard of acronyms. So hold on. But these things are important because all these acronyms represent important institutions which are there to protect us. So, and to protect human rights. So let's go back to the UN. We have the UN founded in 1946, and this gave birth to the United Nations Environmental Programme in 1972, because the environment matters. Then, in 1988, we had the establishment of the IPCC. So, the IPCC is a child of the United Nations Environmental Programme and the World Meteorological Organization. So those two organizations come together in 1988 to give us the IPCC. Now, what does the IPCC do? Well, this is where all the top scientists work on the latest research and data about the climate. But just having a group of scientists talking about the climate is not enough, because it has political implications. So therefore, you need a political structure to help this science make its way into policy. And so we arrive at the UNFCCC. So the UNFCCC was established in 1992, basically to protect this. So far in this episode, we've talked about this as a democratic space, but now we can talk about it as the atmosphere. So just like we need to protect the democratic space for all these cornflakes to have a happy life, well, also, you can't survive as a human being if the atmosphere doesn't work. So, the UNFCCC was established in 1992 in order to try and protect this, according to the latest science, which is understood by the IPCC. Okay, I hope you're not wilting under all these acronyms, but there is one more acronym to talk about. And okay, let's bring the cornflakes back. The thing is that now you've got the IPCC doing the science and the UNFCCC providing a political framework for decisions, but you actually have to meet sometimes. And this is the final acronym, COP, Conference of the Parties. So a COP is when the scientists and the politicians come together to talk about how we can implement more effective measures to keep this space properly protected. Now, there are a few qualifications to this, and I mentioned in the previous episode on carbon budgets that at the IPCC level, there's a little bit of political interference. Okay, but we can't go into detail on that now. The main point is just to say that we do have an imperfect political structure which is in place to protect the environment, and that is the UNFCCC. And to finish this section, we need to zoom in on Article 2 of the UNFCCC, because Article 2 states the goal of this organization. What is it there to do? And the answer is this, and I quote, "It is there to achieve the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system." Simple, no? Don't funk around to a dangerous level with levels of greenhouse gases. We need a safe operating space for our human economies, our human societies, our human civilization. We need a stable, safe atmosphere. Simple as that. So Article 2 states very clearly what the only goal of all those COP meetings are, what all of those IPCC reports are, the AR 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and eventually 7, What does all of that add up to? What's the fundamental goal of all of that? It's the stabilization of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to a level that is not dangerous. And this makes me think of different memes, because there's a meme, I don't know if it's still out, my children always tell me, yeah, okay, I got Papa vibes, but I know there's a meme about you had one job to do. So the UNFCCC has got one job to do. So I just share these maybe old-fashioned memes with you about that. Because what we saw in the previous episode was that the UNFCCC is not doing its job. The concentrations of greenhouse gases are going up. We are not yet in an energy transition. We're still in energy addition mode. So the one job that the UNFCCC has had, and for which all of those COP meetings since 1995 in Berlin, all of those COP meetings have been about stabilizing greenhouse gases, and they haven't been doing it. We've only seen an acceleration. So let's applaud the UN for establishing a framework to do with climate change. Let's applaud all the nations of the world that signed up for that. And at the same time, let's hold it to account to say, you're not doing your job well enough. Why does the Paris Agreement matter? Given everything that we've just said, arguably the greatest achievement of this process, set up by the UNFCCC, negotiated in COP, was the COP that happened in Paris, COP number 21 in 2015. In Paris, what they agreed was something extremely important, because if you go back to the chapter on the absolute basics, what is essential is that the temperature, the average temperature of this atmosphere does not go too high. And in Paris, what was agreed was, quote, to limit the increase of the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 above industrial levels. So the Paris Agreement fixes in place this limit, certainly not over 2 and preferably close to 1.5. So that's the framework which everybody's working towards. But as we've seen in previous episodes, and as we'll see in future episodes, we're not yet on track. So the ideal is in place, but the practice hasn't caught up with that yet. What are NDCs? An NDC is a nationally determined contribution. So each nation can decide what it is going to contribute to keeping greenhouse gases at a safe level. So these contributions are voluntary. Each nation can decide, well, we're going to bring this to the party. We're going to do this much. Sometimes it's decided at a European level, but essentially an NDC is each country's commitment to a certain reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions. The precise numbers about the gap which exists, this emissions gap between where we are now and where we've got to get to, between our promises and our practices now and where we have to get to prevent pushing the atmosphere to these tipping points, that will be discussed in chapter 7 and other chapters, and it has already been looked at in chapter 4. For now, I just want to zoom in on the NDCs in one very specific way. And that is to point out 2 problems. First of all, these contributions are only voluntary. They're not binding. And secondly, the way in which we do these contributions, the way in which they are reported, is a complete mess. So different countries make different promises in different formats. So it's almost impossible to know what it all adds up to. Let's take some examples. China's promised net zero by 2060. Japan has promised net zero by 2050. But the EU has promised to reduce its emissions by at least 55% by the year 2030 based on 1990 levels. So different countries make their commitments in different formats. This is very confusing. In fact, if you think about if you had a child at school. Just hear the format of the EU's commitment. Imagine if your child at school got a school report on their progress, but it was framed in the language of how the EU reports on its NDC. So the EU promises to reduce by 55% at least by 2030 based on 1990. So imagine your child gets a maths report and it says that we hope that Jennifer will achieve 55% more in her grades in 2 years based on what she was doing 7 years ago. You'd have to, as a parent, you'd have to go and find out what she was doing 7 years ago, and you'd have to do some pretty complex maths. Why do you report it in that way? It's so convoluted. This way of reporting on climate change is absurd. So not only do we have mixed formats of reporting, but the main format, which is this percentage by a certain date based on another date, is completely mad. And it's weird because can you think of another place in our human economies or human societies where we do things in the same weird way? Does the Bank of England, for example, say that it hopes to achieve a certain inflation rate based in the future of a certain percentage change based on a level that it was in the 90s? No, it just says we need to keep inflation around 2%. It's clear. Now, why is this a fog? Why do we have this fog over NDCs? Well, surely the answer is because people are trying to mask the fact that we're not on target. And they're trying to camouflage an ineffective response. And it's now time for our deep dive, because in this deep dive, I'm going to expose that I'm not just being fussy about the numbers here. I know from personal experience that this is the case. So this deep dive is essentially asking the question, what no dashboard? What no clarity? Why do we have such a fog in these NDCs? And the answer is simple. It's a purposeful fog. It's not by accident, it's by design. In COVID, when that virus happened, what happened almost immediately was the establishment of dashboards. Dashboards which were publicized every day, which showed how many spare beds there were, how fast the virus was spreading, and the numbers on those dashboards controlled government policy about if you could go outdoors, if you could open your business, if things could go back to normal, if you could travel. So the whole economic activity was framed by those numbers, by those dashboards, and they were established by scientists and they were followed by politicians. It's a kind of a unique moment in human civilization where public policy was driven by science. Now, the problem with climate change is that all of this architecture of the UN has been set up, and these COP meetings and these NDCs, but there's no clarity to them. It's just one enormous fog of numbers. And this deep dive is going to expose how that is purposeful. So this story goes back to one of the earliest climate academies. Students from 2014 15 and 16. So this group, this cohort, we had a special project. And the project was to try and get some famous people like Angela Merkel, the Pope, and Juncker, who was at the time the head of the European Commission, to sign a document which basically just acknowledged the carbon budget, the fact that that budget is equally shared. One last time back to the cornflakes. This air here is surely equally shared by all the people on the planet. If we don't accept that everybody here has an equal right to breathe, then the UN is fundamentally undermined. Everybody is created equal. So the carbon budget equally shared per capita, and how that plays out in terms of national numbers. So that was the document that we invited all these different people to sign. And the way in which we did it, with Juncker, for example, is that the students organized a kind of phone bombing campaign. So we managed to get the phone number of Juncker's office, and the whole of S6, so like the A level, the baccalaureate year, the whole of S6 and 7, they had a coordinated hour slot where they would phone that number. So we kind of put their office out of operation, because every time the secretary put the phone down, it would ring again. Is it okay to sign the document? Now, okay, it was a kind of funny tactic. In the end, it worked. What Juncker's office said in the end was, okay, please leave our phones alone. We will look carefully at the document and see if we can sign it. So we left them alone. And half an hour before midnight, on the day that Juncker left office, he signed the document. And he said, thank you for your efforts. Here's my signature, and please meet with Cañete. He is the incoming commissioner in charge of climate change and energy. Okay, great. So a meeting was set up with Cañete. Cañete was Spanish, and he had a history in the past of being quite influenced or quite under the influence of the petrochemical industry or big agro business. And so it was a little bit suspicious back then that Cañete had been put in this role. So there was a noise in the media around Cañete about his appointment to the commission because of this background. Now, I'm not saying anything. In fact, putting together the energy portfolio with the climate portfolio could have been a terrific move. If you're going to act on climate change, then you have to act on the energy infrastructure. So putting those two things together is a pretty smart move. And maybe Cañete could have used his understanding of those things in the background to good effect. So it was great. We were given a meeting with him. The meeting was on March the 20th in 2015. And you can see here the document that gave us access to the commission building. So we're in the meeting with Cañete, and the students are well prepared. They have met already with top climate scientists to check the numbers. We wanted to make sure that our numbers were absolutely correct. And we met with one of the most eminent climate scientists in Belgium, Ipsala. And he said, yep, these are good numbers. These are the numbers which science agrees on. This is the carbon budget at that time. And so we presented to Cañete over about 25 minutes the fact that the 2 degrees relates to this carbon budget, and the fact that this budget should be equally shared, and so on. And at the end of the meeting, we asked Cañete if he would sign a picture of himself with this text. And the text has got just 2 numbers on it. One number was 2 degrees, and the other number was the remaining carbon budget at the time for that 2-degree limit. And Cagnette, as you can see in the photo, he signs. The students couldn't believe it, because just getting clarity at that level, notice just how small that is. That is just the degree and the carbon budget. That's all it is. But to get that agreement from a top-ranking politician at the time was amazing. So under the desk, one of my students did a little message in Facebook saying, he said yes, he signed. Because there was a little team outside that were having coffees. There was like the team in the room and another team kind of waiting outside. So we had this agreement. And in fact, in the meeting, we even discussed how we could put these numbers on the side of the commission building. And it was a little bit weird because the meeting for 10 minutes was about, yeah, we could do it with lights, or we could do it with a tapestry, or with, I mean, it went into quite some detail about how these numbers will be. So we were like, whoa, woo, we did it. Again, it's just over simple science, nothing more spectacular than that. So the meeting concludes, pictures are taken, blah, 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 thank you very much, goodbye. And the students go downstairs to have a coffee, and I give the memory stick with the photos on to the secretaries and say, great, maybe you could do a publication about this on your website, we'll stay in touch for the practical details, etc. And suddenly the mood changed. It's like, no, you did something naughty. You hijacked the meeting. There's no way we can make this public. So I was like, okay, but the students have gone now. Like, what's the game? And it was refused. I was accused, along with the students, of hijacking the European Commission. Okay, roll forward a couple of days. I get home from work and I get a phone call from the Guardian newspaper. I can't remember the name of the reporter, and he's interested. He doesn't know anything about this meeting. We haven't told anybody. We're just wondering what to do next. So the Guardian phoned me. They got my number through the school, and they say, "Oh, we're really curious. You had a meeting with Cagnette. How did you do that? Because we have been watching Cagnette since he came into office, and he has had 67 meetings, and 65 of those meetings have been with big business. And 2 of them were not. One of them was with the Red Cross, and one of them is with this, what is this Climate Academy? And what was your meeting about?" So they were curious about the meeting. So I told them exactly what happened. And then they phoned the commission to verify whether what I said was correct. And the commission basically said, "You cannot run this article. You cannot say this." So you can find the truth of what I'm saying in the absence of those photos anywhere in the public space. So these photos that are now in this video, they've been sat in my OneDrive for years, and it's like an untold story which I can tell you now. But isn't that crazy that the commission blocked this publication, this endorsement, and it even didn't go into the national contributions. It didn't even go into how much the EU is responsible for that carbon budget. It was simply at the level of, this is the remaining carbon budget for 2 degrees. So the control of what is said or what is not said about the carbon budget, about how close we are, this is very strictly monitored. Very strictly monitored. And you can see that at a more general level if you look at COP29. Look at COP29. There's something weird in the text there. The COP29, which was in the UAE, That was the first time that the word fossil fuel was mentioned. So, for 29 years, you have been talking about climate change. You have been saying that you're going to deal with the problem, but that's the first time. It takes you 29 years to say the words fossil fuel out loud. So, the UN, let's applaud it for its commitment to solving climate change. Let's applaud the scientists working in the IPCC who are supplying the UN with all of this fantastic up-to-date information. But a bit like with the original tennis court oath and the absence of women, we also need to point out what is missing in this. And what is missing is a dashboard. What's missing is just basic clarity about how close we are to these carbon budgets. And it's astonishing that we don't have that. You look in The Economist, look through the page at the back of The Economist, you have all of that data about the price of gold, the price of oil, the price of various indices, the CAC 40, the FTSE 100, etc., the NASDAQ. You find all of those numbers. Can you find the carbon budget in there? Can you find a clear statement about how close we are? Can you find how each country is got a different responsibility for that carbon budget? Do we have that kind of dashboard? Nope, we don't. And that is not by accident. It's by design. And my little story with Cagnette illustrates just how fiercely those kind of statements are protected. In a way, it's a small story, but it illuminates all of the pressure which is on climate science communication. So we understand why these NDCs are said in such a foggy way where it's almost impossible to add it all up. Well, worry no longer, because we do have a dashboard. That dashboard is the Cut X Index, and that's chapter 7. And we will get there once we've gone through chapter 6, which is about who is responsible, because it's no surprise, the EU is a big emitter. It's one of the big emitters, and the UN is still quite a colonial organization. The UN, the architecture of the UN, who funds it, who runs it, how it's run, the apparatus of the UN crops out the global south. So just like in that picture, you have the women cropped out and pushed to the sides, it's the same in climate change. The way in which we report on climate change, the way in which we understand it, it's not done clearly. It's not done democratically. It's not done with any transparency. So the Climate Academy is totally committed to that and has been for many years. So that's the end of the deep dive. I'm finally happy to get that story out. I've not known what to do with that story for years. I was told by The Guardian that if I did individually run with the story, they would, quote, come down on me like a ton of bricks, the commission. I asked The Guardian, what does a ton of bricks look like? They didn't really know, but it was just made very clear to me that this was not going to be made public. So I feel safe enough now to put it out in the public. I'm not pointing any fingers at individuals, or I mean, maybe Cagnette himself was. Who knows? I don't know what happened behind those glass doors once I left the building, and I don't know who was responsible for blocking it. But systems understanding, the Climate Academy is committed to systems understanding, and the system blocked it. So we need to liberate our systems, our communication systems, to communicate these absolutely essential climate truths. So that's it. End of chapter 5. And don't forget to go on the Climate Academy Moodle to do the little quiz. 10 questions, multiple choice, taken from a random selection of questions. It shows and demonstrates your understanding of what you've just learnt. The Climate Academy textbook can be found on the website. Just download it and we move on. So chapter 6 is going to be about who is responsible. And as we just mentioned, what we're going to see is that actually the global north is basically responsible for the climate crisis, and the global south is going to suffer the consequences.